Hello, it's Scott Manley here with episode 29 of Kerbal's Spaceships Are Serious Business, and the kind of serious business I am up to is docking. This is going to be my first serious docking maneuver. This whole episode is pretty much going to be played at 4 times regular speed because docking is one of those very slow, very careful processes. Now in Kerbal Space Program, it's quite common for you to see that there's a lag of a few hundred kilometers and essentially boost yourself up to a higher orbit for just one orbit and then catch up and, then fix yourself. Real life, you wouldn't do that. That would take too much fuel and you would be coming in too hot. And if you had a problem, then it wouldn't work out too well. So what instead I'm doing is something a little more reasonable. I'm starting out in a pursuit orbit lower down in this case. And then as I get closer and closer, I'm progressively going to raise my orbit so that I eventually end up just making a very small correction and I should arrive in the vicinity of the target with a velocity of, less than 30, 40, 50 miles an hour. Basically, relatively low speeds. Obviously, if you crashed at that speed, it would still be bad, but this is far more sensible, far more realistic, far more sedate than we would normally do in Kerbal Space Program. But here we go. This is going to be our burn to get the intersect going here. So we've set this up. And when this burn finishes, we're going to be watching the rendezvous planner. You can see the separation at closest approach is dropping down, dropping down, dropping down. We're going to get within, it's kind of messed that up, but there you go. So we got within about 1.7 kilometers, and I'm using the RCS thrusters to trim that back when I overshot. We can do this, of course, because we're in low Kerbal orbit. If we were trying to dock in deep space with light speed delay, that would be kind of hard. So yeah, what I'm doing here is just firing the translation thrusters, trying to reduce the separation distance just a touch. We'll continue doing that throughout the orbit, and that should bring us in towards our target a little closer, a little more visible. So now we're below it, and we're going slightly faster. So what's going to happen is we're going to fly underneath it because we're now going faster, and then we're going to come up in front of it, and because we're now at apoapse, it will be catching up on us. So the idea is it will come up from behind us, and we'll meet it basically. Here we go. You see, it's now catching up on us again, and now we're going to cancel our velocity once we get super close. So using, of course, the reaction control system to reduce our speed. Says time till closest approach is 1 minute, 1 minute and 0 seconds. There we go. And when the time comes, we will kill the velocity. We will murder it mercilessly in its sleep. It shall be given no mercy. We shall not allow any velocity when we are trying to dock there. So yeah, the relative velocity was a bit higher than would be realistic, but then again, I am 1.7 kilometers out. So we're not quite, this isn't quite a perfect docking yet. I should have added some more intermediate maneuvers where I used the translation thrusters to trim the closest approach, but that's fine. We can actually make this approach. We have 840 meters per second of delta V, so we are going to have no problem here. So while we're making this close approach setup, I'm going to use the reaction wheels for much of the control. And this is going to be slow, but very, very methodical. So again, we still have a very small amount of relative velocity here that we want to cancel out. But 2 meters per second, 1, and there. Now, 0 meters per second delta V. Now, we are in a slightly inclined orbit here. We're just going to bring ourselves across. You see, because we are running parallel to this thing, that means we're actually inclined, and we will eventually come close to it. But of course, our orbits aren't perfectly matching. So we're going to use our thrusters to do that. 3, 4, 5 meters per second. That is a pretty serious burn that we put on there, but the higher it is, the less we have to deal with the curvature of the Earth. Although, to be fair, we have less, problems dealing with the curvature of the Earth around the real Earth than, Kerbal, because the orbital period is about half an hour, and because the space is curved a lot more. Curvature effects actually matter a great deal more in Kerbal size, but Kerbal size vehicles tend to have a lot more delta V. There we go. The John Bob Pardo station. So we're now coming in, dropping the speed down just a touch, and we want this thing to be aligned. So I'm going to tell both spacecraft to align roughly in the same direction. And I think I want to put this on the front node. So we're going to move it far. So we'll basically have all the engines lined up. This spacecraft has two docking nodes. On one side is a fuel-only docking node, which we're going to link to this station. And on the other side, which is hidden just underneath that completely redundant and pointless command module, we have a crew-capable docking port. I have not actually developed a spacecraft a crew pod, which is designed for the crew-size docking port. So we're just going to have to work around that. Basically, because I haven't installed the mods that give me the Gemini capsule, the next capsule that I'm looking to unlock is Apollo, which is a 3-person capsule. I don't have a 2-person capsule, which is, kind of irksome because I really want to send 2 crew to this station, and I'm going to have to do it using two Mercury-sized pods. Okay, John Bob Pardo station is right behind me. I think it's behind me. Yeah, it must be behind me. And it's going to be giving me a push once I catch up on it. How appropriate. They're 15 meters out, and I don't have any docking nodes or any docking aids or anything, so I'm just using the good old-fashioned nav ball to keep these things lined up. We know the orientations are going to be consistent, and it's just a case of arriving at the target at roughly the right position, and I'm way off center, but thanks to the magic of magnets, how do they work? We are docked, and we have now a serious space station here, with which is validating, or it's valid for our part of the contract. Now, we've bonded these two things together. The next thing we want to do is make sure they are at the correct altitude, which is above 400 kilometers. So, setting up the engines, burning to get our apoaps above 400 kilometers, and then we'll zip around. Once we are in the correct position at the peak of our altitude, ready to do our maximum conversion of our velocity into periaptic altitude increases, that's when we will burn our engines, and then, oh yes, that periaps will surely rise to the value that I desire. Come up, come to daddy, come to 400 kilometers. We know up here where the air is clear, that's where you want to be. We don't want to drop down to a pleb like 400, sub 400 distance. There we go. And there, excellent. We have our spacecraft, we have it in orbit, we have satisfied all the requirements for launching a space station. And now, the next thing we need to do is put some crew on it. But first, in the time that it takes to build our spacecraft, our ferry spacecraft, we've reached the next maneuver node for the Martian device. So the Martian device is, it missed Mars originally, and now it's doing a burn to essentially put it in a much more Mars-like orbit. It will arrive at Mars with a relatively low velocity, and hopefully that will make capture relatively easy because, well, let's face it, I'm using a lot of fuel here to get the thing lined up. So after getting the initial burn, we spend a little bit of time tweaking the maneuver node to try and get it as close as possible. So it's kind of convenient in this case because Mars is actually quite close by. What I'm doing is essentially I've put myself out slightly in front of it just due to being really poor at navigating. And now we're putting ourselves into a slightly higher Mars-like orbit, and it will eventually catch up on us. So they're tweaking this using the mouse wheel is the best way to do it. We want to get this down to, well, a few hundred kilometers, something suitably close, something Mars atmosphere skimming. That is great. So 127 meters per second, set up the node turning, and then set up the burn execution. Execute that. And now, of course, we're going to have to do time acceleration, let that actually get into position. So, insufficient avionics warnings mean nothing, one would hope. But given the totally random state of all these mods, you never quite know what's going to hit. Incidentally, still trying to get things running on 1.12. We have had some issue with the life support configuration of late. Yes, this is a lot of fun trying to make this work. But this is stable and I'm not going to break it. Not going to try updating it because that way leads to all sorts of random failings and updates. Ready to make my burn, 42 seconds. Oh, things are warming up. Engines are getting pressurized. Well, they should always be pressurized if they're in deep space. And there we go. Watch this line. Watch this line of the close approach move in and... Ooh, 100 kilometers. Wonder how high the atmosphere is on Mars. I know 80 kilometers was considered too low for Mars Climate Orbiter, but I don't know how low is too low for this. Elsewhere, of course, we still have the Venus device too, which is orbiting Venus and occasionally passing over new and interesting areas of the surface. Yeah, there we go. Geiger counter, gravity, telemetry, all that stuff over a place called Fortuna Tessera. Now, Tessera are structures on Venus' surface which are kind of like folded, and they're very complicated terrain, and honestly, since we can only see them from space, we have no idea how they're created, whether it's like some sort of interesting tectonic process, or like what form the tectonic process takes, whether it's like a crustal thing, whether it's a squishing, or a crushing, or a pooling, or... And, you know, since I know nothing about Venus terrain, I shall just go to the next thing that I did, and that was... I get ready to send my crew to the space station, and that requires lining up the orbits. Now, the problem is, well, every time I seem to line up the orbits, the space station is nowhere near it. Now, because this spacecraft this spacecraft has something like, 2 days of life support, basically. So I can't afford to spend several days catching up on this thing. Also, I think the batteries won't last that length of time. So every time I go over, I watch to see how close it gets, and is that close enough? You know what? I think that's going to be close enough for me to launch. So, step out of here, go to the vehicle assembly building, launch, put Tatiana and Gail both on board, and we are ready to launch and start chasing down the Pardo. Yeah, the Bob Pardo station. I'm sorry, I giggle every time I think about Bob Pardo station. So yeah, let me see, this is a slightly different variation on my launcher. We're still using the Proton lower stage here. We're not launching nearly as much mass into space, so we're only using a lighter lower stage here. The second stage is still using my beloved LR87 LH2 engine. I have a great deal of love for this engine in the RP1 mod. Partly because it's an engine which was designed and tested but never actually flown, but more because it has pretty darn good efficiency and it has plenty of thrust. In fact, this rocket never goes below a thrust-to-weight ratio of 1 for its whole ascent into orbit. This engine is just great. The only downside is that it can't relight because it's supposed to be a vacuum engine, but it could easily be a launch engine. I love it. It seems totally overpowered compared to everything else, but you know what? Maybe that real engine was just that good in reality. I don't know. I haven't looked at the numbers. I mean, sure, its specific impulse is only 400, and the RL-10 has a specific impulse of 420 or thereabouts. Besides, if I have the number 420 anywhere in a video, you know someone will bring up the whole Pop Manley thing, right? Never mind. Anyway, now we're in orbit and we've ditched the aeroshell. You can see that we didn't have the technology to build a two-person capsule. No, we have two separate one-person capsules, and those will be what carries my crew to the station. So it's an interesting design here. They're designed to land separately. We have little propulsion units fore and aft containing basically an aerosine dinitrogen tetroxide mixture with of course guidance thrusters, reaction control system, and we have the solar panels there. Now, first thing I'm going to do is correct my inclination. I got within about 0.61 degrees of the target inclination, which is pretty good. The nice thing is that we're in a much lower orbit, therefore we will catch up with the station pretty quickly. So the only thing that I found with this is that the spacecraft does have a habit of kind of wobbling around and not holding attitude particularly well. It means that we spend a lot of fuel just jittering around trying to hold the correct attitude. And I'll point out, although it says that I have 384 meters per second of delta V, this is designed so that I can pump fuel between these two tanks that are essentially the same size. This was the way that I decided to balance this whole thing so that we can use the translation thrusters without having to worry about torque being induced and wasting more fuel. We don't have huge margins on this, and I'm going to be very careful. I would really like to get to the station with sufficient margin that we can leave some fuel behind, because the station thrusters use this fuel as well. Anyway, that's us, and we're 0.01 degrees, so that's pretty close. So the next thing we're going to do is start chasing this space station around. Now, you notice our current close approach is over 2,400 kilometers, and now our closest approach drops to 200. So at this point, what I'm going to do is begin raising my periaps. So there's a bit of fooling around with maneuver nodes before I decide that what I really want to do is raise my orbit up to be much closer. And rather than set up maneuver nodes for that, it's more a case of let's just point at prograde, because we're pretty close to the lowest point in our orbit. Let the thing settle down and fire up that engine. We're going to raise the apoaps up to 375. That puts me within roughly 30 kilometers of the target vehicle. Now, the magic rule is 7. So 7 times 3 is 210 kilometers. So we should catch up on this thing in the next orbit or so, roughly, depending upon... there's a lot of leeway on this, but with the next orbit or two, we should be close enough that we can perform our actual transfer up to the target and then approach it in front of it or behind it or nearby it. So there, we're coming up below it. And we're, of course, going slower than it now because we are near apoap, so it's actually moving away from us at this point. And the next thing we're going to do is burn the engines, and that will mean that we will circularize the orbit, and then we will start chasing after it again. And so from that circular orbit just below it, we can begin our Hoffman transfer orbit to get close to it. So just a little bit of a burn here. Watch the periaps again. We're bringing this up to 375. The more circular you can make these orbits, the easier these multiple transfers are. And the other way to do it is just to keep bumping your orbit up closer and closer and try to maintain your approach. I think that's what that's what they tended to do in the past, although nowadays the difference in the altitude when you're coming from a rendezvous orbit up to the actual space station is a lot smaller than I'm dealing with here. But, I'm not flying a Soyuz here. I'm flying a modified Mercury capsule. We didn't have the technology to go and develop the Gemini. Apparently, the Gemini it's on some modeler's drawing board somewhere. And we haven't had the space, so we decided let's just stick 2 Mercury capsules together. That'll totally work. I mean, I call these Mercury capsules. They're not really Mercury capsules because, well, for a start, the crew can EVA and they can get in and out, and that didn't happen until Gemini. Incidentally, somebody pointed me at the Flight Systems Redux mod, which has a really, really nice Gemini control panel and cockpit, or a really nice Gemini IVA. Anyway, look, we've got our orbit set up, and what we're going to do now is go for the next burn. It's going to be a very small burn, something like 30 miles per hour, and that will put us up onto a very close approach of about 600 meters. So there's a station in front of us now, and we're going to make this burn, and we'll do the usual thing where you go underneath it and then come up in front of it, and then it catches up from behind. There we go. So now closest approach, 631 meters, 631 meters. And the next thing to do is we're going to run time forwards, and once we get, within about 10 minutes of approach, we can use the translation controls on the capsule and get that approach distance down really close for the final docking. So get my alignment set up, transfer some fuel for balancing, and then we will be getting ready for final approach. But we'll see that in the next episode. Until then, I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.